Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Rahul Tandon, and in the early hours of Thursday, the 3rd of March, these are our main stories. The United Nations General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with just 5 countries voting against it. Many Ukrainian cities are being bombarded by Russian missiles and shells, amid fears the casualty figures will be very high. And the Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich has announced he's selling Chelsea Football Club. He's promised to donate the proceeds to victims of the war in Ukraine. Also in this podcast,
the bottom line is we will eliminate plastic pollution from our environment. This is a very, very big decision.
The United Nations agrees to draw up the first ever global treaty to tackle the scourge of plastic waste. And as pro-Kremlin media outlets are forced off screens in the UK and the EU, we discuss the role played by media in times of conflict. Russia has stepped up its attempts to break Ukrainian resistance to its invading forces, firing more shells and rockets into civilian areas and deploying extra soldiers, including paratroopers, to fight their way into urban centres. Cities in the north, east and south have come under attack. Moscow has admitted hundreds of its troops have been killed, but the price being paid by Ukrainian civilians is also becoming increasingly clear. 2,000 people are estimated to have died. Who is in control of different towns and cities is hotly disputed. But shortly before we recorded this podcast, the mayor of the Black Sea port of Kherson conceded that his city was now in Russian hands. Hussein is trapped in the city with his wife and 3-year-old daughter.
It doesn't look good for me. So maybe I'll try to move from here. But so far the situation is bad. I don't have a lot of expectations since the city has been invaded. Before that, they were pushing it a bit. The Ukrainian forces, they were fighting them out of the city, and we had some hope, like maybe the city will get back normal. But since it is almost in their control now, almost 99%, I don't have much of hope, actually.
In the east of Ukraine, the city of Kharkiv has been subject to intense bombardment by Russian forces in the last 24 hours. Sustained Russian rocket fire and airstrikes have caused substantial damage, and there are reports of fighting in the streets involving Russian paratroopers. The mayor of Kharkiv is Igor Terekhov.
It is a very tense situation now. We can hear shelling, explosions. They shell housing premises, administrative buildings. We have to go to the basement, to the bomb shelter, in order to save the lives of the people. This situation is very dangerous.
Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, remains under threat from a convoy of Russian vehicles heading towards it, as well as sporadic aerial bombardment. The Ukrainian boxer Vladimir Klitschko and his brother, the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, told us how proud they were of their fellow citizens.
People were nervous, but I am very surprised how patriotic people are right now in Ukraine. Right now, I go to the blog post and see the people with different profession. One of them, doctors, another one, actor. No anyone can expect they take in one day the weapons in hand. Right now, they proud to fight for his houses, for his city, to defend the families. We doesn't have another choice. Russians exploit information here in Ukraine, Nazis, nationalists, and some people who need the help, but nobody can fight these people who is Nazis right now as the Russians, because they killed civilians, they killed Ukrainians, they came to our country, to our homes. And that's why in Kyiv right now, huge movement for civil defense.
Taking Kyiv, of course, will be Moscow's ultimate goal. But as our security correspondent Frank Gardner told Nick Miles, the bombardments in the east and south of the country are likely to grow over the coming days.
I'm sorry to say there are no great surprises here. It's part of the Russian military playbook to make extensive use of artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, cruise missiles, drones, basically what is known in the military as FARs, things that fly through the air and land and go off with an explosion. And their standard tactic is to basically dominate an area, crush the opposition, and then roll in with the tanks and the infantry. They haven't been doing much rolling in. They're not taking a lot of ground, but they are firing a lot of weapons. They could fire an awful lot more. They dominate the airspace. They could be using airstrikes, and they probably will increase that. There must be quite a degree of frustration in the Kremlin that a week has gone by and they haven't so far taken any major cities. I mean, I know it's disputed about Kherson, but clearly the Ukrainians haven't completely given that city up. And they certainly haven't yet taken the capital, Kyiv, or Kharkiv, the second city. Unfortunately, I think that this is the calm before the storm.
And Frank, we've talked a lot over the last few days about this big military convoy to the north of Kyiv. We are now seeing that there are military manoeuvres in other areas close to Kyiv. Where do you see this going over the next few days? Do you see this encirclement of Kyiv happening closely?
I think the only clues we can get for this is to look at how Russia has tackled urban warfare in other cities, in Grozny in Chechnya, in Aleppo in Syria. And unfortunately, it's not very encouraging because they took an awful long time to subdue those cities. In Syria, obviously, in conjunction with the Syrian Air Force, but there were huge civilian casualties, and essentially they pretty much razed them to the ground. Those I've talked to who know President Putin's way of thinking and operating and the Kremlin way of doing business in this sense would say that he would rather have a smouldering ruin as his neighbour than have it in the Western camp. So there are some formidable units like the paratroopers who've gone firm around Kharkiv, and the GRU will be active there. That's Russian military intelligence. There will almost certainly be an assassination team looking to try and decapitate the government. What it boils down to is President Putin would like to shorten the time between where they are now and a situation where a puppet government is in power, backed by the Russian military, that then signs a treaty with Moscow to say, hey, we're friends.
Frank Gardner, our security correspondent there. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis continue. A few hours ago in New York, the United Nations wrapped up 2 days of debate on a resolution deploring the Russian invasion of Ukraine and calling for an immediate withdrawal. The resolution, which won support from 141 of the 193 member states, came at the end of a rare emergency session of the General Assembly. Russia's ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, chose to concentrate on the 5 countries that voted against the resolution and the 35 which abstained.
Colleagues, your refusal to support today's draft resolution as a vote for a peaceful Ukraine free from radicalism and neo-Nazism, living in peace with its neighbours and refusing to be managed from outside. This was the aim of our special military operation, who the sponsors of this resolution tried to present as aggression.
But the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, saw the vote very differently, saying it was loud and clear and he would be guided by it.
We don't have a moment to lose. The brutal effects of the conflict are plain to see. But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb.
Our correspondent, Nada Tawfiq, was following the debate.
It was very emotional at times in the General Assembly Hall, listening to the Ukrainian ambassador, very combative at times, hearing Russia, the very few allies it had, speak. And then I think there was a sense of real shock in a way to see 141 nations. It was such an overwhelming number that it even exceeded Western diplomats' hopes of how many nations would stand up and how isolated and lonely Russia would be in that chamber. I mean, it is a very lonely list alongside Russia, Belarus, Eritrea, Syria, North Korea. That's it. Their key allies, including China, Cuba, Iran, all abstained in this vote. And so I think here at the UN, there is a real sense that everyone understands the gravity of this, that they understand this is not just about Ukraine. This is about the UN Charter and everybody's territorial integrity and safety as nations. The United Arab Emirates, that did abstain in the Security Council in the General Assembly, did actually vote in favor of this resolution because, remember, it's not a legally binding resolution. It is more a representation of kind of the moral authority of the world. It's more symbolic. So less is really at stake for nations to express their support for a resolution of this sort. But as I say, Cuba, for example, Iran, those countries abstaining really sent a strong message that Russia very much so is isolated.
Nada Tawfiq there. Now, as we've been telling you on the Global News podcast, many governments have imposed economic sanctions on Russia. Companies from oil giants to tech firms are scaling back or pulling out too. Now, China may have abstained in the vote that we just heard about, but it has said it will continue trading with Russia as normal. Beijing has refused to condemn the military assault on Ukraine. State media, meanwhile, has tended to focus mostly on the impact on its own citizens in Ukraine. That's in stark contrast to what people are able to read and watch about the conflict in Taiwan. As Nick Miles heard from our China media analyst, Kerry Allen.
China's media coverage of everything that's been happening over the last week is more focused on, are the Chinese safe in the country, and hopes for a peaceful resolution. But there hasn't actually been much in terms of anything that might be seen as critical of either Russia or Putin. Taiwan, meanwhile, has been very, very different. It showed demonstrations on the street outside the Russian embassy in Taiwan, that the leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, is donating money to Ukraine disaster relief funds and very heavily condemning this.
Taiwan, the government and many people there have strong reasons to have an affinity with the people of Ukraine because obviously Beijing doesn't recognise Taiwan as an independent country. Are you getting any kind of sense from the media in Taiwan that is the elephant in the room for them?
Absolutely, yes. Just from Taiwanese papers in general, you're getting the sense that people are thinking if there's a time for China to invade Taiwan, that it could potentially be now. And there have been stories, for example, one news website called Taiwan News saying that people have started seeking out information about their nearest bomb shelter just because they are worried, just in case, because, they didn't think, like I think a lot of the world didn't think, that this would actually happen.
Kerry Allen there. Now, the events in Ukraine are affecting many aspects of life, including sport. In another significant development, the Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich has confirmed he intends to sell Chelsea Football Club, one of the English Premier League's top teams. He's promised to donate money from the sale to help victims of the war in Ukraine. It follows growing worldwide pressure for sanctions against Russian oligarchs who are close to President Putin. So, did this come as a surprise? Andrew Peach asked our sports reporter, Shojo Saka.
The answer to that is a capital yes with a small no asterisk, if you like, because a week ago this was not on the cards. Highly unlikely that Roman Abramovich went to bed thinking, oh yes, I want to sell Chelsea and I want to tell the world I'm going to do that in the morning. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine has just dramatically changed the landscape, of course. In the UK Parliament, questions have been raised about whether the government should be going after the Russian oligarchs, their wealth, their assets, which you've been hearing so much about. We've already seen Everton affected. They've cancelled sponsorship deals with companies belonging to the billionaire Alisher Usmanov, whose assets have been frozen by the European Union. Roman Abramovich had announced, and that was a surprise then on Saturday, that he was giving stewardship and care of Chelsea to the club's charitable arm. Although the charitable arm in question, they've been a bit reticent to accept that responsibility. It transpired that a Swiss billionaire, he'd given an interview with a Swiss newspaper there, and he said that he'd been offered the chance to buy Chelsea. His name's Hans-Jörg Wyss. He's in his 80s. And he said that Roman Abramovich wanted to get rid of Chelsea quickly due to the prospect of these sanctions and so on. So I guess we'd been given a little bit of a hint, but really, over the course of a week, this is a dramatic surprise, yes.
So there's one potential name of a buyer you mentioned. Roman Abramovich has made it a very desirable commodity, incredible success for Chelsea during the 19 years that he's owned it.
It's been incredible, yeah. The past 25 years, Chelsea have won, 5 Premier Leagues, most of that under the Abramovich era, a whole host of domestic cups, 2 Champions Leagues, 4 other European trophies, the FIFA Club World Cup as well. So he's transformed them into a powerhouse, Andrew. Back in 1992, when the Premier League first started, there were the big 5, and Chelsea weren't in that. That was Man United, Liverpool, Everton, Arsenal, Tottenham. And if you think about it, last year, all that hoo-ha about the European Super League, well, Chelsea are one of the big 6, they're one of the big 12, if you like, across across Europe. It's amazing. So I should say that Abramovich has said that he's owed about £1.5 billion from Chelsea, and he says he doesn't want the loans to be repaid. And as you mentioned, the proceeds of the sale of the club would be donated to war victims.
Our sports reporter, Giorgio Sacca, there. Still to come.
What we did, in a way, was to hack the fact that people are constantly using their phone or playing with their phone.
Scientists in Chile come up with a novel way of testing for COVID. Before that, some other news, and the United Nations has agreed to start negotiating the first global treaty to combat worldwide plastic pollution. Nearly 200 countries at the UN's Environment Assembly in Nairobi have unanimously agreed to create an intergovernmental committee. The aim is to negotiate and finalise a legally binding document by 2024, which cuts the amount of plastic finding its way into the planet's ecosystem. More details from Helen Briggs.
There's growing concern that discarded plastic is destroying habitats, harming wildlife and contaminating the food chain. And because the problem spans international boundaries, a global solution's required. In what's being seen as a landmark decision, the United Nations is moving forward with plans to bring in a legally binding international treaty that targets plastic at all stages of use, not just clearing up bottles and straws in the oceans, but addressing the design, production and recycling of all plastic products. Environment groups say the resolution paves the way for a cleaner, safer future for people and the planet. But turning off the plastic tap won't be easy. At the current rate of production, there'll be an estimated 1.3 billion tonnes of plastic on the planet by 2040.
Helen Briggs there. Let's move to South Asia now, because in Afghanistan, the Taliban have been carrying out a massive city-wide operation in the capital, Kabul, going house to house conducting searches for what they say are criminals and illegal weapons. As Sikandar Kirmani reports, human rights groups have accused them of intimidating families, with some residents burning documents linking them to Western authorities.
An alleged Islamic State group fighter detained during this search operation confesses to being a member of the group in a video shared online. The Taliban say they've also confiscated a large number of weapons in Kabul, a city which has long had a high crime rate. Some residents describe the Taliban as being polite when conducting searches, at times accompanied by small groups of women. Others, however, have been angered by the invasion of their privacy, or terrified that they will be targeted for having links to the previous government. A number of residents told the BBC the Taliban had been more aggressive in areas of the city dominated by people from Panjshir province, where a small group of anti-Taliban fighters remain. The search operation is at least partly an attempt to stamp out armed resistance to the Taliban before the spring, when the warmer weather traditionally heralds an uptick in violence. In the past, it was the Taliban responsible for that. Now, they're the ones in charge.
Sikandar Kirmani there. Now, in some parts of the world, people are beginning to return to work. In others, COVID cases continue to rise. Testing is still key to monitoring the spread of the virus and detecting any mutations. A Chilean startup company called Diagnosis Biotech have developed an accurate, non-invasive and low-cost method of testing for COVID-19 called phone screen testing, also known as POST. Our reporter Jane Chambers went to find out more.
I've come to a swanky office block in a business area of Santiago called El Golf, which has stunning views of the Andes Mountains. This is where Chilean scientist Dr. Rodrigo Young, the founder and CEO of Diagnosis Biotech, is doing one of his pilot schemes. He told me that after carrying out hundreds of thousands of traditional PCR tests for his work at the University College London, he was determined to change how things were done.
So our method tests for COVID, but instead of testing people's nose, we test people's mobile phone, which is quicker. It's non-invasive, obviously, and it's a lot more simple. What we did, in a way, was to hack the fact that people are constantly using their phone or playing with their phone. The fact that we're constantly on our phone makes it a very good readout for what we have in our bodies.
I decide to put the new method to the test. 2 people in white coats with blue rubber gloves are waiting for me in a little room. So I've just registered for a test. which was very, very quick. I've now got a unique barcode, and I'm going to hand it over to the person who's doing the test. I've never had a PCR test like this. He's just getting out a swab, which he's going to put over just my mobile phone. Very thorough. He's swabbing it, the whole of it. And the swab's gone in a little tube, and now I'm just cleaning my mobile phone screen and praying that it doesn't come out as positive. Muchas gracias. So, what is the difference between this and a normal PCR test that I might need for travel or something like that?
Well, actually, this kind of test you can't use to travel. This is what we call a pre-diagnostic test. So rather than certifying that you have COVID or not, it's a way to screen massive groups of people. Our level of accuracy is very, very high, nearly 100%, just as accurate as a lateral flow test as well. But the difference in our case is that you don't have to swab your nose. So that makes it a lot quicker and a lot less invasive.
Rodrigo and his team accept that their test isn't there to replace the gold standard clinically certified PCR one. Instead, it's a way of making sure that more people, mainly asymptomatic ones, can get tested and not pass the infection on to others.
That report from Santiago by Jane Chambers. Let's return now to the conflict in Ukraine and its global ramifications. Apart from the obvious economic impact, the propaganda war is intensifying. We heard earlier about the challenge it's posing for China in Taiwan. Now the Russian media outlets RT and Sputnik have disappeared from television screens across Europe after being banned by the EU, which accused them of spreading misinformation and propaganda. RT, formerly known as Russia Today, has also gone off air in the UK. Our correspondent Colin Patterson has been watching the channel.
What it means is that our channels are no longer allowed to broadcast, whether that be on applications.
The Russian state-backed television network RT reporting the news that they have been banned from broadcasting in the European Union. And in the past few hours, RT has disappeared from all platforms in the UK, where the feed comes from Europe. The broadcast ban is the result of sanctions imposed by the EU to prevent two Russian state-owned broadcasters, RT and Sputnik, from being received across the EU until it says the aggression towards Ukraine ends. In a statement, the EU said the channels promoted systematic information manipulation by the Kremlin, and the tap for Russian state-controlled media in the EU was being turned off. Although the UK is no longer in the EU, it's still affected by the decision because the sanctions were applied to the satellite companies in Luxembourg and France, which provided the feed of RT to Sky, Freesat and Freeview. This was the moment when the feed from the Sky platform ended.
First of all, it's about pressure on Russia.
In the UK, the media regulator Ofcom is currently investigating RT for 15 potential breaches of the broadcasting code in relation to impartiality in its Ukraine coverage on Sunday. Any action could take weeks. In a separate development, the BBC has confirmed that as part of an operation to ensure news is available in Ukraine and Russia, it has launched 2 new shortwave frequencies, which are broadcasting 4 hours of World Service English news a day, which can clearly be heard in Kyiv.
Colin Patterson there. And let's stay on that theme because media content is blocked by many governments around the world. But it does seem that President Putin's regime isn't able to control the information agenda as it did before. So how many people have been accessing what the authorities may not want them to see? Gareth Mitchell put that question to 2 experts. In a moment, we'll hear from the technology journalist Bill Thompson about how news websites can be copied on the dark web using a Tor browser. But first, he spoke to the BBC World Service strategy analyst Abdullah Al-Salmi.
At the moment, our services are still available, especially the online ones. The situation is still worrying. Obviously, we can see the rhetoric between governments is going up. And because of that, we think that the BBC might fall as a collateral damage.
And I suppose Russia could be quite likely to retaliate by blocking the BBC, and that's where some of your approaches may come in. So let's talk about VPNs first, and treat me like a beginner here, just for people who don't quite know what a VPN is. What does it stand for, and what does a VPN do?
Well, a VPN stands for a virtual private network, and in its simplest terms, it's an application that changes the user's way of connecting to a website. So if a user is from one country, uses a VPN, it appears as if it's coming from another country. And this way it allows it to circumvent or go around online blocking and censorship by deceiving the censors.
So that's something that people in Russia might, if they're media and indeed internet savvy, they may well have VPNs on their devices to allow that. Is that something you're helping them with, or are you just saying, look, if you use a VPN, then that's just one way of still being able to access our services?
As BBC, we don't provide VPN services of our own. However, we have a list of what I would call circumvention tools that allow the users to get access to BBC content. And technically, a VPN does it in a certain way, but some other tools get you to where you want to go without necessarily encrypting your connection.
One such company, for instance, is Siphon. So that's spelled beginning with a P. And it's free, it's open source, and it is an internet circumvention tool or internet censorship circumvention tool. Tell me a bit more about that.
So Siphon is a company that's based in Canada, and it's run by a group of individuals who work mainly for internet freedom, which means creating opportunities for people to access the internet as we know it in the West and in North America. And we started using it around 2012, 2013 to respond to what then was an emerging situation in Iran, where our services were being targeted by the Iranian authorities. And Siphon is a tool that is not a VPN technically. It's a tool that uses different approaches in order to get you to a website that is blocked. And it's very popular in many parts of the world. I would say in Myanmar, in Iran, and I think it's growing in popularity, and I expect it to become more popular in Russia as well if the situation worsens.
What does it look like for the user?
It's simply an app that you install as if like any other app, and the moment they run it, they have to press another button to connect to the Siphon way of funneling the internet connections. And this opens up all the blocked applications, all the blocked websites. So it's quite an efficient tool.
Now, Bill Thompson, in the introduction I mentioned the Tor browser, a means of getting onto the non-indexed web, if we can call it that. So how will that help people?
Governments rely for internet censorship on knowing the places they need to block. Because every organisation and many companies, whatever, rely on having access to the internet, just putting a whole block on the internet, closing the internet, as we know, internet shutdowns, can be very expensive and very complicated and do enormous damage. And so what a government would do was try to block specific sites. If you don't know where the site is, and if people are using anti-circumvention tools like Tor to get to those sites, it becomes a lot harder to limit people's access to them. So that's why this combination of tools, as you heard from Abdallah with Siphon, with Tor and others, become important, that individuals who want to be able to get to trusted news sources, sites that they trust as individuals, can use a different range of ways in which they can do that. I think it's worth saying that, because if a government is blocking a website, then it may well be that using these tools brings you to the attention of state authorities. And so it's not something that you do without risk. And it's important also to recognise that none of these tools is foolproof. They can't be absolutely guaranteed to protect your identity or to protect the information about which sites you're visiting. So anyone should use them with caution and with a proper assessment of the risks they are taking in order to get access to material that their government has decided they shouldn't.
Gareth Mitchell there in conversation with Bill Thompson and Abdallah Al-Salmi. And that's all for us for now, but there will be a new edition of the Global News Podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can, of course, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. This edition was mixed by Chris Hansen. The producer was Nikki Varico and the editor Karen Martin. I'm Rahul Tandon. Until next time, goodbye.